What I wanted to do is I've just been handed at one of my clients is an interim assessment. So kind of
Mhm.
wanted to refresh my memory because it's been a minute since I've done an interim assessment. So kind of wanted to walk through what that is, how it gets kicked off, the time frame of it, and all that. So let me share my
Mhm.
screen. So started looking at, of course, my trusty HITRUST handbook of all things HITRUST, and of course they talk about an interim assessment and a bridge assessment. Now, I've not, I've never had to conduct a bridge assessment. I've seen a bridge assessment
I have.
after it's been completed. Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
So have you also done interim? Because you talk kind of through the
Yes.
differences between the two of them?
Sure. So a bridge assessment is more like so I would liken that more to an E1 or something along those lines where they've got set controls. You have to demonstrate an intent. I would really encourage people against a bridge assessment. It's going to cost you more money.
Okay.
It's much better and more efficient for your team and your pocketbook if you plan ahead and just do the assessment. The interim assessment is, as far as interim assessment is just, basically a checkpoint in the middle. And that you're going to want to make sure you do the advanced planning. Now, the difference between the interim and any of the other assessments is that the submission date, this is very key, submission date of your interim does not change your assessment date. So you can
Oh,
submit
okay.
early. You
Okay.
can submit early and it doesn't change your date. So
Okay.
that's actually really important and very helpful. So if you've got a quick and easy interim assessment, there's no reason to drag it out.
Yeah, looking at the handbook, it looks like High Trust will actually create the assessment object and then alert you through their notification systems that, hey, your interim assessment's been created. And I know in the past when that's happened to me, it feels really early because, but then if you have an annual CSF subscription, you can actually generate it 120 days prior to the submission or the anniversary date, the 1 year anniversary date. And I wanted to be clear that interim assessments and bridge assessments are only valid for an R2. There is no interim assessment for an E1 or an I1 because they are both 1 year assessments anyway. The other cool thing about the interim is it's a subset of your controls and it's not like a percentage. So it's not like if you have 580 controls versus 350, your interim is still usually the same number of controls with the caveat that it's
Mhm.
also every single control that has a corrective action on it,
Yes, yes. So
which
if you have a lot of caps, your interim is going to be big.
bigger, yes.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
When there are caps involved, that submission date, as opposed to where the cap completion dates are, it's important. And it's important to connect with your assessor and make sure there's an agreed sequence. Because if those completion dates fall kind of in and around that assessment due date, you just want to make sure that everybody's on the same page about if that cap is complete in advance and how far in advance it has to be complete in order to get the evidence.
Yeah. So that one that we were celebrating a couple weeks back that only had 4 QA tasks, and probably very few caps, you're like, okay, good. This is one
Yeah.
that's going to be, less than 25 controls total that have to be looked at.
Yeah.
But otherwise, yeah, we think 19 controls, and you're like, oh, that's easy. And that also helps kind of understand, to your point about corrective action plan milestone dates, because
Hmm.
you can't push everything past the interim assessment date, because HITRUST, when you're going through that, is going to say, well, no, not everything can, you're not going to wait to start on this until a year in, but you have to be very
Right.
selective with what you say will be done prior to your interim assessment and then what will be done after your interim assessment, because they need to show. That's why all of those controls are looked at in the interim, is because HITRUST wants to make sure you're making progress on those corrective actions,
Right.
which is because your certification
Yeah.
with CAPS is kind of a conditional certification. It's like,
Correct.
okay,
And
we're
you have to, they actually have a threshold. They have a threshold of 50% of your caps have to be at least started. 50% of the caps have to be started before your interim assessment. So
okay.
if you have a large number of caps, keep that in mind. HITRUST has a very specific threshold on this, and you want to make sure you can prove all of those caps have been started with detailed information, meeting notes. If you're not big on meeting notes, you need to get big on meeting notes. Even if those meeting notes are, detailed out in an email sent through, different levels of organization can use different levels of circumstance, but you still have to do it.
And I guess to prioritize that, what I probably would look at from just a practical standpoint is, policies and procedures are probably the easiest things to start on when it comes to corrective actions. The implementation of a control is always going to be the most difficult piece of it. Um, so, I guess what I would look at, if you're looking at your corrective action plans and you have to hit that 50% minimum threshold, look at the ones that are policy or procedure or documentation focused, and you can definitely get those started within a year. I mean, it's not difficult to get a document
Mhm.
reviewed, even if it has to go all the way up the chain to, the highest levels. You can still get that done within a year, or at least get that started within a year. The whole implementation piece would be where that you maybe have to push some of those timeframes out past. I'm not going to be fully implemented in a year because I've got to get budget, and I've got to we've got to fit this into an implementation
Mhm.
timeline. But at least you can get started on them by having your documentation up to date and prove that, and that's a pretty easy thing to prove during an
Right.
interim.
If you've lined up and you know who the control owners are for each one, and if the person, somebody new has come into that role, the time to figure that out is before your assessment begins, if possible, because then you're not scrambling to try and reassign things during that
Mm-hmm.
assessment, which ends up with people having less time than they should to gather that evidence. Any
Mm-hmm.
evidence that is for a cap can actually, if you're only demonstrating cap progress and not implementation, you can gather that as you go. You don't need to wait for
Right.
that window, because it might be an email chain. It might be, oh, this happened at this date or this date. You can gather that evidence as you go. And whoever the control owner, is that it coincides with the cap, have them, put that evidence in a folder that, is associated with it. You might have more than one control owner, because, I certainly encourage, where controls are very similar and overlap in their remit, join it up. You don't need separate controls for that. Or sorry,
Right.
you don't need separate caps for that. You can have one cap that is actually tied to 5 or even 10 controls, as long as they're relevant and it genuinely is the same. HITRUST doesn't mind that. And you can join those up in that single project and say, right, this is the cap and these are the controls associated. And here's who's going to own that cap. Don't assign every control owner there. Have a single owner for that cap and make sure that person just putting the evidence in when they get
Right. Well, and you can update the corrective action
it.
plans in HITRUST as you go. So you can,
Mhm.
I always made a note to at least quarterly go into my assessment and update those corrective actions, because it was a good reminder for me to, oh, these are coming up. They are going to be scrutinized. And I
Mhm.
think it gives, a better story that you have been keeping up with those and you didn't just, shove them aside and
Yeah.
then bring them out 90 days before your interim assessment date.
Right.
Because you show that, and HITRUST can see that progress in their actual system. And then, to your point, I don't know that you can upload evidence that you've done it, but I know you can at least change the status and say I'm in progress. Usually you have like 3 or 4 milestones that you've documented you're going to do or you plan to do, and then if those change for whatever reason, or if you're done early, you can definitely put those notes in there in the corrective action, and then have all that evidence ready
Yeah.
for that interim assessment.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And I think it's important to stress that the interim assessment is not a different version of high trust CSF than what you were originally evaluated on. So it's not like high trust is pushing in any surprises. There's not going to be new controls that you've never seen before in your interim. It's, if you were on
Right.
11.2 for your high trust assessment, the interim assessment is going to be based on those controls, and
Yes.
not a reworded version of that control or anything like that, which I think is helpful to understand because, new versions come out and point versions come out, at least once or twice a year. And here
Mhm.
you are at that anniversary going, okay, now am I being evaluated on something I haven't even seen before? But no, it's fair in the fact that it's really looking at, okay, from what you were evaluated on last year, this is making sure that you're maintaining those and moving forward.
Right. And with that in mind, you're also not allowed to change things like your factors or the scope for an interim. So
Right.
if you're planning on adding in maybe a new application to a platform, or you've got planned growth ahead, just keep in mind that that doesn't those are not things that can change at the interim. They have to be planned for the next assessment. So it's really important to just look a little bit ahead. And maybe you want to go beyond the geographic jurisdictions that you have right now. You can say, right, we want to plan for international presence or for multi-state presence. You can do that, and you can look at the comparison. Again, my CSF subscription. You can look at the comparison to see what the difference in controls, and then make sure you've done those controls, which clears the path for the leadership team. It means that when they go to then make those decisions, the company's already got the organization's already doing the security
Mm-hmm.
measures that are required to clear that path forward for them.
Right. Yeah. Once you've got your high trust CSF subscription, you can kind of use an extra assessment object provided your subscription level allows you that you've got enough
Mhm.
of those assessment objects left. But yeah, you can go in and do that kind of that what if planning, and
Mhm.
what if we decided to add this assessment factor? What if we decided, and kind of understand what those controls will be. And yeah, I think there are reports in there that actually will do a side by side comparison of the assessments and say, this is not in this one, but it's in this one. And,
Mhm.
you can see, if we add privacy controls, we're
Mhm.
adding another 180 controls. And what are those controls that we would be adding? Can we realistically do that, type of thing. So yeah, I
Mhm.
think that's important.
Absolutely.
That's important too. Nice. So anything else you want to talk about with interim assessments? I mean, I know it usually feels like a breeze, but any gotchas or anything that you've kind of been like, oh, I wish I'd known that.
I think my suggestion in general with high trust is don't sit back and think you can hit the easy button on anything. Look at the whole amount of work and plan accordingly.
Yeah, and I would also, talk to your validated assessor because chances are it's going to be the same one, unless you're
Yeah.
just really unhappy with who you had and you're jumping ship. But those validated assessors, they have that experience, and so they kind of see what those trends are.
Mhm.
I don't think it's always exactly the same 19 controls, but it's one control from each of the 19 domains. I
Right.
don't know that it's necessarily always the same ones, but they can kind of tell you from their experience going through these with different organizations what they
Mhm.
found. And it probably does change as high trust realizes there's an emerging threat or there's a control
Mhm.
that they see people stumble on from, year one of their R2 to the next
Mhm.
time, 2 years later, where did they maybe stumble there? And maybe that's what they'll use in the interim to kind of see, well, we want to make sure that that doesn't go by the wayside. Whereas there might have been a very easy
Mhm.
control that they were originally assessing in the
Right.
interim that they're no longer going to do because that's not moving the needle or making sure, that you haven't gone backwards in your security
Right.
controls.
Right. The only other thing I would say with the interim is that keeping an eye on your caps impacts your interim cost a lot. If you have, a very small number of caps, that is going to keep your interim costs for assessment quite low. If you have a large number of caps, that's going to really increase how expensive your assessor fees are for that interim assessment. Not only your assessor fees, but also the amount of work that your internal team has to do.
Mhm.
So those are all things that I encourage organizations to really think about, because if you're trying to work on an efficient budget and keep that reined in, because security assessments, as we all know, can get very expensive very quick. And it's really important to make sure you understand where you can achieve cost savings and how.
Mhm.
Delivering a strong security assessment with a minimal number of caps is not only good for your organization and good for your security, it's really good for your interim budget. So,
Right.
making
Yeah.
sure that that is streamlined is helpful all around.
Yeah. And understanding that, if a customer or potential customer of yours is savvy as far as HITRUST, they're not going to look at just that one page document. They're going to want to look at what your corrective action plans are,
Right.
because that's going to tell them the story of, they know what the baseline is for
Mhm.
certification, but this is going to go, okay, this is where the sections that need the work. And so to that
Mhm.
point, I certainly wouldn't encourage a lot of corrective actions that were strictly documentation, because to your point, that's going to drive up your interim assessment. So as much as you can do at the very first time you go through your R2 assessment, make sure your policies and procedures, your written documentation is as thorough as it can be. The other nice thing about
Mhm.
that is as you're going through that, those have to be in place for 60 days before the start of the assessment. So you have that time where you can, implementation is always key. So you can implement it and then you can document it, as long as you're documenting it within that 30 days. Um, so, 90 days for implementation before you start your
Mhm.
HITRUST assessment, but 60 days before you start for documentation. So you've got a
Mhm.
little bit more leeway as you're going through that readiness and saying, okay, well, I got to focus on implementation because that's really where I'm going to get corrective actions. I may have gaps in my documentation, but you can kind of take a look at that. But yeah, it's very important, because you certainly don't want a lot of corrective actions that are documentation only, because that is going to drive up your costs. Hey, thanks for watching. We really appreciate it. If you got value from this episode, hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next HITRUST Secrets. We go live every Thursday at 2 p.m. Central and dig into real world compliance and security topics. And each session gets uploaded right here after the live show. So whether you're catching us live or on your own time, make sure you're subscribed. We'd love to have you along on your HITRUST journey.